All right, welcome everybody. This is the Reading League Montana, and this is a Teacher Tuesday series that we're specifically focusing on how the science of reading supports our special services departments. And some of you may say that that's special education. Or you have different names that you've evolved into. But mostly what I would like to say is that this is a team of educators, psychologists, speech language pathologists who are serving those who demonstrate reading difficulties and that have been in the process of really figuring out how to serve those with reading difficulties to the best of their abilities. And they're going to share with us tonight. So I'm really excited. And I'm going to hand this over to my colleague, Patty Johnson, and she's going to take it away. So thank you, Patty, and welcome everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Nell. Yes, I'm Patty Johnson. I am a member of the Reading League Board, Reading League Montana, and I'm a speech language pathologist and also very interested in literacy. And so today we have 4 different participants who have spent lots of time and given lots of love and care in special education. And so I'm going to briefly introduce them. Our first participant on this panel today is Genevieve Thomas. And Genevieve is an educator and consultant living in Whitefish, Montana. She's worked as a special education teacher, reading specialist, school psychologist, and special education director. And she currently serves as the Director of Professional Learning for School Services of Montana and consults with schools and districts around the country through her organization, Spark Educational Consulting. She has a graduate degree in special education and school psychology, and she's currently a doctoral student in the reading science program at Mount St. Joseph University. So welcome, Genevieve. We're so glad you could be here today.
Thanks, Patty.
Yeah. And our next participant is Hannah. Hannah has been working as a school psychologist for the Livingston Public School District since 2019. And previously, she worked at school districts in Wisconsin. Hannah works closely with teachers, administrators, and specialists to implement the science of reading within grades K through 5. She's highly involved in Livingston Public Schools MTSS process and evaluation and identification of students with reading difficulties. At the start of the 2023-24 school year, Livingston Public Schools transitioned to identifying students K through 5 with specific learning disabilities in reading using response to intervention criteria. So she's here to share her perspectives from a school psychologist, and we're so welcome. We're so grateful to have you here today, Hannah. And Tanner is here as a special education teacher, and he's been in the special education world for 7 years in many different capacities, wearing different hats, or she, I'm sorry. Tanner has worked in both Bozeman and Belgrade Public Schools, completing many roles in the school setting. Tanner's been the lead in self-contained behavior programs, organizing a life skills classroom, and working as a resource teacher from ages kindergarten to 6th grade. Tanner has devoted all of her professional learning to student behavior and literacy components, and she has worked closely with teams to build the best community citizens they can be, which is such a great thing for all of our students. So welcome, Tanner, and we're so glad that you are here as well.
Thank you.
And Nell, and Nell, our wonderful Reading League Montana leader, is also here standing in as a speech and language pathologist as well, and will be able to speak from that perspective as well. So I'm going to start off by asking some questions of our different panel members, and then we will open it up to whoever has additional questions from our listening participants. So let's start with Genevieve. Genevieve, how has deepening your understanding of the science of reading influenced your work as a school psychologist?
Yeah, so I mean, I feel very fortunate when I was coming up as a school psychologist in my training program and in the initial districts and organizations I work with. We, you know, as a strong multi-level support. We were talking about RTI, then now we talk about MTSS, but those were really in place in the districts I was working in. And we were using an RTI model to find students eligible to receive special education services. So in that model, it really required me I had to really deeply understand assessments. I had to understand what is an evidence-based intervention if we're going to look at whether or not a student is responding adequately. So I think that type of model really requires school psychologists to become experts in the pieces of the process that we're going to be consulting on and supporting with. But I think even outside of that, just personally, I felt like, you know, I was working in these schools that had pretty good systems in place. Like they had screeners in place, they were identifying kids, they had some good like standard protocol stuff happening at tier 2, and they were coming to me when they didn't know what else to do. They already knew the basic things. Like they already put a structured literacy intervention program into place. And so I think just ethically, I felt like I need to be, you know, if teams are going to come to me when they're out of answers on their own, I need to be an expert. I need to know more, so that I can, add value to these conversations. And most of my referrals were due to reading disabilities and reading differences. And so that it made the most sense for me to kind of hone my expertise in that area.
Awesome. I think that's, you know, really great and a really great place to start. I'm wondering, Hannah, from your perspective, can you tell us a little about what Livingston has done to transition to qualifying students through a response to intervention model? To kind of build off what Genevieve was saying.
Yeah, so like most of the districts in Montana, Livingston was using a discrepancy model to identify students with learning disabilities, including the area of reading. And so I came in, I think it was the second year of the literacy grant. Now you might have a better memory of that, but I think that's when I came into the district. And so teachers were already you know, working in the science of reading as far as just in their own instruction in their classrooms. But that was a year we really got some multi-tiered systems of support in place. We had systems for screening students, progress monitoring, you know, identifying which students need to go into which reading interventions, kind of with the focus being around reading. We're trying to expand into other academic areas now. So we spent a lot of time really focusing on building up our screening and progress monitoring assessments, and then our interventions. And then the next year, we actually really, as far as student services, really dug into like diagnostic assessments. That was a big step we took. We kind of did a little series where we would meet once a week, and we were, I think we were reading Kilpatrick. Yeah, I can't remember. And yeah, I think that, and so we were talking a lot about then diagnostic assessment. That was special education teachers really honing our skills in that area. Did a lot of work with Nell on that. And so we kind of used all these pieces to kind of get to the point where we felt like we could start looking at using RTI, and discrepancy was just really starting to not make sense anymore, because we had students going into interventions first thing in kindergarten. So they were never going to be significantly discrepant, as we would hope they wouldn't be. So it was just like, we can't even use this anymore. But we know through all of this interventions and this progress monitoring and this really good diagnostic assessment that students are having, you know, are reading difficulties and need identification. So that's when we officially moved last year to just K2 identification through RTI and reading only, and then this year K5. So just wanted to work through that, just K2, because we're grade banded buildings, and then we moved to 3-5. So that was kind of the process, and I think a big piece of that was getting our MTSS systems up and running, feeling really solid about students' intervention, that they're receiving progress monitoring, and then also getting just really training, especially our special education teachers, and even myself further in diagnostic assessments, that when we were going to be moving to that, what were we really going to be looking at, rather than giving, you know, 3 reading subtests on the KTA and saying, yep, looks like there's a reading disability. So we've gotten a lot more diagnostic, and yeah, it's really helped drive, clear goals and then clear services after identification. So those were the big steps we took as a district. And there's obviously things we're still fine tuning. I think we have a population with a significant reading and language needs. And so too, we're always going back and looking at universal instruction, right? If you got 50% of your students coming in not proficient, looking at, yeah, so that you're not referring half your class the first year or something like that. But
yeah, and what is that tier 1 looking like? And,
yes, so that continuous improvement, and we're always getting feedback, when we're looking at those pieces, like, okay, well, do we need to go back then and look a little deeper at tier 1 or different interventions or different structures? So it's the intervention models have changed every year too. This was all happening through COVID. So yeah, we've just been flexible, but those are kind of the big steps we took.
That's awesome. It's great to hear kind of what Genevieve said in a big picture, and then you brought it to a district level. I'm wondering, Tanner, if you want to jump in here and maybe kind of bring it down even closer to the classroom. And how does the science of reading impact your decision-making with your own students? And how do you help MTSS teams to make the same sort of decisions for their interventions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I definitely am a big person of when you come to the table and you are like, they're struggling with reading. And I'm like, okay, so what diagnostic assessment have we done? What data do we have? Because just struggling is not going to guide our decision making. And so I really look forward to seeing some data that classroom teachers have done, or guiding them to either a screener, diagnostic assessment, to level them, find out where they are comparing to a normative group, and to make sure that everybody is making those decisions based on that. There's so many pieces to how we look at language, and at the science of reading really nails it with that reading rope and things like that. And so I definitely look at all of those pieces. I have really, really great decoders that aren't understanding anything that they read, but knowing that totally changes how I'm going to instruct them, or how I'm going to guide other people to instruct other kiddos that aren't actually mine, that are in that MTSS process. And so being really open with, hey, I have a group that's doing this, my co-teacher has a group that's doing this, to really make sure that we're fitting every kiddo's needs, is something that we have really honed in on throughout the year. And using some progress monitoring with just some like benchmark assessments, and then continually giving them, and these aren't standardized by any means, that we're giving regularly, but we're giving some to make sure that we are making some progress and that we are targeting that skill that we're looking at. So is it comprehension? Is it vocabulary? Is it decoding? Is it encoding? Like where do we land, and making sure that we really target that specific skill. And as I look at MTSS teams, I also really guide them to narrow that focus into like, what is the problem? When we give a lot of these STAR or cadence or assessments in those nature, it doesn't always narrow down that like specific thing. And so as we're hoping to see some really good overall progress with our kiddos, we've kind of got to peel the layers of the onion and get to that like solid problem. And so that's something that I really encourage people to do.
That's awesome. And something that I think I'm hearing a thread running through Genevieve and Hannah and Tanner's answers there is the what, that diagnostic that helps us with the what, but the next step is the so what, right? So we have the what's going on, and then the so what, what do we do about it? And that's where that digging a little deeper can help. And I also heard both Tanner and Hannah, and I know Genevieve, this is close to your heart too, but talk about language. And I think we're hearing a lot in the science of reading about phonics and decoding, and how to get those good decoding skills. So I'm going to ask Nell, who is our speech and language pathologist on this panel today, to talk a little bit about the what of a language and the so what. Why is that language piece so important?
Thanks, Patty. That's a big question, right? Knowing that you're also a speech language pathologist, I have to qualify it by saying that this is actually my very big passion area right now. My
Mine
mentor
too, totally.
my mentor was Louisa Moats, and my second mentor was Hugh Katz through a book that he wrote, and he guided me through the text. But now he's truly a personal mentor and friend. But one of the things that language is to us is it's actually our medium by which we communicate and understand the world. So if we really start to consider how rich and complex language is, we also have to go back to in utero. Children start to tune to language as soon as they are able to perceive sound as a fetus. So this piece is so fundamental to being. It's so fundamental to our entire core of who we are that it blows my mind that we have very few early screeners or tools that support language acquisition or interventions. And so when I found that doctors Charles Hume and Maggie Snowling, who both were at Oxford, had done a longitudinal analysis of true language interventions, and then it's called the Wellcome Study and screening. And then that Wellcome Study, they found that when they did applied early language screening and then they applied early language intervention, what happened was that they were able to do regression models that always found that if you understood language early, it didn't matter if you added phonology to the prediction model. Language always was the original predictor of if something was going to go differently in reading. So language, if they took language out and only kept phonology in, it wasn't as powerful of a predictor. Okay, but when language was added, that phonology was added, they could predict even more. So I recently asked this because in Montana it's relevant because we have a new law that says we should screen children early. And in that law, people are going to most likely screen phonology, and phonology isn't the first prediction system, it's language. And it goes back to 3 years of age, in fact, before 3. So I think if we're going to get the science of reading right, and we're going to actually reach all children, if we know early vocabulary and language predicts later comprehension, then we have to start to nail down how to get great language screening and language intervention into our schools, of which Livingston, Montana happens to be a pilot study school for that in the United States, which is a big deal. So that also is helping Hannah in the MTSS process, because if we find the students who have language, it's the second most prevalent identified area. So anyway, we have a long ways to go, but the reason it's so meaningful and for all of you to understand as listeners is that language is the foundation of reading. And in fact, phonology, semantics, syntax, morphology, discourse, it's all language. And so when you are talking about those things, you're talking about language. And so the differences and variations in development, we have to begin to understand so we can better provide the instruction and the interventions as the students need them.
Totally. I couldn't agree with you more. It was making me think back to a conversation some of us were having last night, and Genevieve made a point that some people believe about the science of reading that it's all about pushing the phonics first, and that we'll deal with that upper level, the language comprehension piece of the reading rope later. And nothing further can be the truth, right? Further than the truth, from the truth, because really that upper piece is all those language pieces that kids start learning at birth and are expanding wildly through those toddler and preschool years. So I think that's so important to realize that that part of that reading rope is happening well before kids ever come to school. So Genevieve, on that note, what do you think is important for school psychologists to know about reading? And we'll include language and decoding and comprehend, like all those pieces in there. And what are recommendations you might give for how school psychologists can develop their expertise in this area?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing I'm just thinking about in response to what Nell was just sharing is I agree. We're like so much further along on screening for literacy than we are for language. And even when we do, often language screening is just like a preschool special education evaluation, right? So, but even when we have something like that in place, since this is a panel of providers coming at this work from different angles, I just think about the importance of us kind of battling against this tendency to work in silos, because as a school psychologist, I all the time got kids referred to me for reading disabilities who had speech IEPs, but we act like they're these two separate, like the SLPs down the hall doing speech stuff, and I'm over here figuring out the reading piece. When we know, to Nell's point, that the reading brain is a language brain, right? So I think that's one thing for all of us to be thinking about, is how can we be more cross-disciplinary and working kind of jointly on these things, because they're so tied together. So that's partially answering your question, but more just like what was bouncing around in my head as Nell was talking.
No, I think that's a fabulous thing to add in. Yeah. There is like working as a team, like a lot of times that gets lip service, but then we all get busy and we get in our silos, and figuring the puzzle out for any individual child really does take that team approach. Definitely.
Yeah.
So Hannah, I'm going to ask you to add to that a little bit. What does the evaluation process look like for you when evaluating students for specific learning disabilities in reading using response to intervention? And, I'd love to hear, like, who's at that table? Who are those team members and how are they working together?
Yeah, no, and it's funny because this is all just like building on each other. Because I was just thinking, like, we have really started working a lot more closely as a team, as far as like specialists, like with speech language pathologists, and including that a lot more anytime there is a reading concern brought up. And which has been really nice the past couple of years is we now do have a language screening that Nell was referencing that we are using for all incoming. We have 2 YK, so 4-year-olds, and so that's 2-year kindergarten, and then kindergartners, which is giving us some really nice information right off the bat about where students, and actually this year, that's the only screener we used prior to them starting school. We didn't even do a literacy one. We did those, once school got started, but we used that language one first. So, and we've been doing language interventions, paired with literacy interventions for students that are flagged on those, as well as early literacy measures. So, the process, it begins with MTSS for sure. That's where it's beginning with all the screening and intervention. And so we're constantly, monitoring students, meeting as a team, looking at the data, saying, yeah, do we need to bring a speech language pathologist in? Does the student need to go into language intervention? I'm talking pretty early, 2 YK, K. And then, as we have had this is something we're still working through a little bit more, is having clear decision points for when to refer. And it's hard because Nell and I were just having this conversation. Every student has such a different profile too, like some have both language and, early like phonological processing difficulties, and then some don't. And so it is kind of on a case-by-case basis, but essentially when we do determine that as a team, a student needs to be referred for a special education evaluation, we're using all of that data that we've been collecting through multi-tiered systems of support. It's kind of like pieces of that evaluation have been done already. We're just maybe coming in and doing some more diagnostic assessments. And in some cases, we have already done some of those diagnostics prior to the referral as part of the intervention process with parent permission, because we want to better guide the interventions that we have students in. So sometimes we've done like a CTOP, or I've done like the TILs or portions of the KTA or whatever we might be using to guide some interventions earlier on, or to rule in or rule out things. And then depending on the concern, so we'll do more of those diagnostic assessments. And then it's really then looking at the Montana RTI criteria at that point. I sometimes do a cognitive still, because I think it's still sometimes good information as far as like a risk factor.
Sure.
But we're really looking at more of those diagnostic academic assessments than putting so much weight on like that, just those two data points of a achievement score and a discrepancy or IQ score,
Yep.
you know. So it's
There's
more of this
much more of the so what, you know?
Yes. Yeah. There's a lot more of like looking at the interventions they've been in and the, you know, the progress monitoring, any formal diagnostics that have been done along the way. And then those diagnostic assessments, which then ultimately leads us to looking at the RTI criteria, which is, you know, it looks a little different state to state, but it's fairly consistent as far as, you know, lack of response or response requires a significant need of level of intervention to continue. And we do have, I'd say, quite a few students that we're identifying both with language type, you know, disability as well through that process. We're seeing that quite a bit. Sometimes not, of course, but, and then, which it's all super great data because it just rolls right into writing those IEP goals, because we've done all that diagnostic work. And so, and even have a good idea of what kind of intervention has or has not worked already. So, I'd like to say like a lot of, by the time we actually make the decision to refer, a lot of kind of the evaluation has been done, you know, through the process. It's really the goal is that we've really kind of looked at all those pieces before we're kind of getting to that point. So,
and I think that is really an important point there, that so much work has been done and has been done maybe with people that the student has gotten to know. It's a dynamic assessment, right? And so we're not just taking a snapshot in a moment of time with the stranger, but we have all this rich data that has allowed us to teach and then measure how students are learning, and then teach some more and measure how they're learning, which is just so fabulous. You know, it's one of those things, like sometimes you see a new product and you're like, why didn't anyone invent that product a long time ago? It's kind of that sort of mentality, right? Like, why didn't we think about this a long time ago? So, you know, but wonderful that it's happening now. Tanner, what do you see? What do you do to see the most progress with student growth in the classroom?
Yeah, thank you. There's so many different things because every single student, just like Hannah was saying, has a different profile, and that like moves forward into the classroom. One thing that we are working on as a special education team this year is really trying to include our speech paths within our reading groups. And so working as a team to kind of team teach reading groups has been really, really beneficial. And where my speech paths are only pulling students in very, very small groups for very specific articulation needs that the whole group does not need. And so they're really targeting those areas as far as when they're pulling them, but as far as like their language or communication or just like pragmatic language, they're serving that either in the whole classroom or in our smaller special education groups. I've heard a lot of feedback from my speech pathologists that they've learned more about their kiddos and they feel like they're able to write. Yeah, they are able to write much more girthy goals and better plaths, and like they get a better sense of what their student actually is going to need as they go into the classroom because they're there in the classroom. And so it's been really fun to kind of have some open classroom doors and some people willing to step through them. And so that has been really, really helpful. I see a ton of growth in my students when we do really targeted interventions for them that go along with their skills. And so making sure that I do know, like I'm not giving a super long vocabulary lesson to a kiddos that's like, vocab's not my deficit area, you know, where I'm really, really targeting what they need instead of going front to back in an instructional manual. You know, skip around, roll the dice where you need it to go and find that page, use those sticky notes and let it roll.
Yeah. I love how dynamic and individualized this all allows us to be with students and with groups of students. That's awesome. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Now, as we've been talking about like opening doors and SLPs walking through them, I think if you interviewed SLPs in this country, many of them would love to be in a position in a district like yours, Tanner, where it is really collaborative and where they're doing authentic work with the kids, you know, whatever they're like working on in the classroom, but then also in these groups to be more explicit and more systematic. So Nell, tell me, like, what's the dream end here for SLPs in our school system?
First of all, I want to say, Tanner, do you need to jump off?
I am gonna jump off. Thank you guys so much for having me on today. Yeah, I'm
Thank you.
Thank you for
at
coming.
teacher conferences. Thank you. I
Yeah,
appreciate
and if
you
anybody
guys.
has
Wonderful.
anybody
Thanks.
has questions of Tanner, we can email her with questions either now or if you're listening to this later. So just let us
Yeah,
know.
and Nell has my number, so if she needs to quick text me as I'm bouncing around at conferences, I can try and jump back on if I need to. Thanks, guys.
Okay. Thanks so
Yeah.
much, Tanner.
So back to your question, Patty. I'm like Genevieve. I'm not a practicing in school speech language pathologist, but the first 8 years of my life, I actually spent in very, I'm going to just say intense environments because I had 90 kids on my caseload sometimes. And so I
Yeah.
know the reality of being burdened with something that's very unrealistic for a speech language pathologist. When I think ASHA's numbers are between 35 and 42 is an ideal caseload.
Yeah.
So, the joy that I'm seeing through the work in Livingston with Molly, this SLP, is just to see the brightness on a face when they're like, oh my gosh, you guys found the kids for me. Here's the reality of the future. So if I look back, I kind of just developed this thought process where I'm like, when I'm 70, will I be thankful for the decisions I made when I'm, at this point in my life? And one of the greatest decisions I'm having right now is around my clarity on how to be collaborative and de-siloing this experience, as Jack Fletcher at the Big Sky Summit spoke about, that special education or getting an IEP is becoming like it's a civil right. But what really has to happen is that we see that education is a civil right for all children,
Absolutely.
and that literacy is a civil right for all children, and that to reach that for our most at-risk students, we have to provide the most informed Tier 1 core instruction, and that has to be where we place our eggs. And that means all specialists have to help inform that core body of knowledge and not wait for a child to get some specialized something down the road. So that, and when I think of the speech and language pathologist, I think of all the resources I had on my shelves when I was the classic newbie coming into my middle school that I worked in. And I thought, I'm not going to sit in this broom closet and pull off a book off the shelf and do.
And it is often literally a broom closet.
Yeah. I really was in the broom closet, and I had mice and everything. And so I got in trouble my first year because I was taking speech and language pathology into the classroom. And I was brought up on mediation charges because I was told that I was only the speech teacher and all my work was supposed to be pull-out. And that's a travesty, because what had happened is that the paradigm of the past had created a vision of the speech language pathologist as the pull-out teacher that only did something so special that nobody could ever imagine what they did. And now we're trying to de-silo that. And I want to give big credit to my colleagues, Mary Dahlgren and Antonio Fierro, for writing Kid Lips, because Kid Lips is this little program that allows a teacher to go, when you say the sound, like in mouse, the makes this buzzy noise on your lips, but you have to put your lips together, and it teaches the teacher how to talk about the production of the phoneme. And that is bringing speech articulation into the classroom and helping our young at-risk readers develop a phonological system that has articulated phoneme storage, because the classroom teacher in core instruction is providing the correct input, not waiting for a speech language pathologist to provide it later on when they see, oh, there's a phonological problem, maybe I should do some therapy. No, it should be first round instruction. So my ideal vision of this is that we start to de-silo it, as Genevieve said, and Hannah as well, that we have to become more integrated, and we have to know that to help bolster core to be the best that it will ever be, and be that it is the first round of defense and should be the best round of defense. And we should have very few children that don't get it in core. And that core, that's not just like, oh, a 50-minute reading block. This, I'm talking like, we get to business. We get our 120-minute block down, and we nail our small groups, and we dial in with our speech language pathologists, our school psychologists, our OTs. Everybody's dialed in to nail it. So then only a small percentage, that 11% of students who need to qualify for that modifications and all the supports that they need, be it that they're low incidence disability or they're a true SLD that needs a lot of support throughout their life, that those are the students who get those IEPs that they really truly need. So I think SLPs, truth be known, some programs are going hard swings back to whole language and speech and language, the Gestalt learning, which is whole language.
Right.
SLPs aren't always informed of literacy and how language is a foundation of literacy, or how to teach a child to read. So while my dream is broad and big for an SLP to be integrated into that, we might not all be trained the same either, just like educators aren't.
That's such a good point. Yeah. And, that really impacts the team, depending on what the background knowledge of each individual on the team is. One thing that you're saying here makes me really excited for SLPs, in that if we're working to help strengthen that tier 1, our caseloads may not be so big. If kids are getting what they really need at that foundational level, then we can kind of turn that around a little bit, which means we aren't having to manage 90 kids on a caseload because they're getting it in their tier 1. That's amazing. Well, this is exciting work, everybody. And I love us all being at the table and talking about it, and talking about how we can be a team, and how, some of these districts are doing such amazing, fabulous work. I want to open it up just for some general questions, and that can be from anyone who's on watching, or or any of the people on the panel. If we have questions from each other, I think let's just brainstorm a little more. This has been a fun conversation.
I do have a question. Hannah and Genevieve, in your experience as school psychologists and doing that very discrete work of trying to ask the questions, to beg the answers, to drive a really solid diagnostic, what has your experience over the last decade, I think, is a good, and Hannah, your span is 2018. Our grant was starting in 2018, but of teacher knowledge, and the role teacher knowledge has played in this for you, and how understanding the science of reading, it takes a lot of time to build teacher knowledge, and what you've seen, because as a specialist, you're trained very differently. And so there's a lot of what I call assume-aside. We assume people have the same information. And hearing Tanner so eloquently talking about, she asked, well, where's the diagnostic? What do we have on this child? I'm sure sometimes you guys ask those questions and people are like, I don't know, I just can't read. So what I'm asking is, have you seen a shift in our educator knowledge base, and how this convergence and de-siloing is a possibility?
That's a great question, though.
You want to go ahead?
Sure, I can. Just from what I've seen in Livingston, and since the grant cycle had started, we've obviously had new teachers come in, and that has honestly been one of our biggest hurdles, is how do we onboard new teachers who may not have this background or this really deep knowledge about the science of reading, so that they are able to bring this to their classrooms. Because the teachers that have been through this since the beginning, I mean, just incredible depth of knowledge and their skills and their ability to, use assessment data to guide instruction. But that has been our biggest question, is how do we onboard new teachers in the district to give them this professional development, because it is so much. And so we've kind of got some, initial little crash courses, but a lot of mentoring. We've talked a lot about, where they are observing another teacher, instruct throughout the day, kind of getting to do pieces like that. One that's really neat too is just talking about bringing those essentially what we would consider interventions or therapies into the universal kind of setting, the classroom setting, which we're hoping to do this year with language in our 2YK classrooms, because the speech language therapist, Molly, is like, oh my gosh, they're so, getting so many referrals out of with those 4-year-olds and just language and articulation and all these pieces. And so looking at starting a whole class intervention, I think we're looking at the Nelly is going to have something for language. And the one classroom teacher has been doing some similar things. I don't know that specifically the LIPS program, but doing instruction like that with kids on her sound wall. Yeah, I think it's been really great to work with teachers who have that depth of knowledge, because it's like you're all speaking the same language, but onboarding new teachers, and then especially like special education teachers who are being asked to work with students who we've already identified are the most at, risk and have the most need or, most significant reading difficulties. And people come from just totally different training backgrounds too, is what I've learned. It's like having the 3 years of extra graduate studies. I'm like, wow, I got to really dig into this stuff that some people, had a class on, and so, yeah, I think ongoing professional development is something we're working on as a district. And I know Patty Durgan, that's been kind of she's been kind of charged with that. So it's a big job.
And I think now I've seen, nationally, I think there's a lot of things happening that are sort of collectively growing our capacity and knowledge and expertise. I think organizations like the Reading League growing in membership, and events like the Big Sky Literacy Summit. I think honestly, with COVID and all of us getting used to doing more of this work, like we're doing it right now any teacher has free access to get on a webinar with Louisa Moats, so I think that there's a lot of positive change that is building our collective knowledge. I do think, what I see as a unique challenge that we face here in Montana and in all rural settings is, we have a lot of these really small K-8 rural districts where there is one special education teacher, and they are responsible for every kid from K-8 and the kids with autism and the kids with intellectual disabilities and all those kids who have dyslexia, and they're, managing IEPs and para teams. And it's just a pretty impossible job. And to Hannah's point, like those are the people who are then saying like, all right, we found the kids who have reading disabilities. Here you go. You're in charge of kind of crafting that program. So I do, I think a lot about, and I think we all need to be thinking a lot about how do we support the specific needs that come up for us with so many people working in rural settings here in Montana.
You bring up something we've been doing work around, and our K-2 school specifically is allowing people to be in a little bit more specialized roles, because, you had the special education teacher who was, trying to teach a reading group, and she's got a student coming in with who needs to be de-escalated behavioral, it was just like an impossible job. And we were like, this is, no. And so we did actually kind of parcel out the programs in that building. And so we've had, creative conversations around like, well, you might have a really large caseload, but this is who you're kind of serving. And you have a really small caseload because you're going to serve this group of students with these really significant needs. And then sharing students across teachers, because, this teacher is really strong with, writing behavior plans and doing behavioral intervention, but they're going to go see this teacher for some of the reading stuff, and they're going to collaborate on that because she's really strong in teaching that. And so also talking about, just because a student's on your caseload doesn't mean that they're only served by you. There might be other people that you can bring into your team that might better serve certain needs for that child. So we've been having a lot of conversations around that. So I'm glad you bring that up.
And I think that's really important, is to start to allow educators even more to find the thing they're passionate about and specialize in that thing. And we get, when people are able to kind of bring their passions to things, I think that allows for a lot of buy-in and a lot of just like self-driven learning, which is good for all the students. So that's really fabulous to hear that you guys have been doing that. Well, I think we're about at the end of our time, but I think this has been a fabulous conversation. Thanks so much, Genevieve and Hannah and Nell, for being here and for having this conversation. It was really exciting, and I'm hopeful it gets to be seen by other people. And really, if there are any other questions that anybody has, go ahead and throw those out there right now, and then we'll wrap up. But Nell does have all of our contact information, so if people have additional questions when they watch this later, they can feel free to reach out to these professionals who are all bringing so much to these students. Thanks a lot, and throw out any questions if you have some.
Can I ask a really quick question? I'm sorry, I know you guys are at the end, everybody's probably ready to get going home. But
no, go ahead.
I was wondering, I work in Robert, and I'm just wondering, I listened to a podcast last week with Gab. I don't know if it's Gab or Gatto, it's hard to remember. But she was talking about, kind of back to exactly what Nell was saying, that reading is language, and we need to really catch kids at these early ages. And this is before they're even in school. And she was talking about maybe some screeners that you could do, but I was wondering if you guys had any insight as to when and where to be doing those screeners to kind of catch kids that might have these language differences that could manifest in reading disabilities later in their education. One of the ideas that Dr. Gadd had was to have pediatricians give these screeners those types of appointments, but she's gotten a lot of feedback there as well.
So, Caitlin, your question is, what are some ideas around putting these screeners in place? Is that what your question is?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I helped validate Nadine Gabb's early bird education. Actually, Livingston was a pilot study site for the Nadine Gabb study as well. And we also did language screens. So I'm going to be honest. I think, since I know that I'm a minimalist when it comes to screening, and I now understand why. And when I could get you the Welcome study by Maggie Snowling and Charles Hume, when it comes back to early screening, the best indicator and the quickest indicator is language. And they have a language screener that they created, which is the one we use in Livingston, called Language Screen. We could make it very available for you too, Caitlin. It's 10 to 15 minutes per child. They Americanize the voice. I helped them validate it in the United States last year and this year. It is the most highly predictive and correlates to the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals at a 0.95. 1 is perfect. So if a speech language pathologist gave a self, and then we give the language screen for 15 minutes, likely that you will find the exact same data. And what we found in Livingston is exactly that. The students who scored low on the screener also scored low on the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals if they ended up going on to referral. So can you screen? Yes. What is the lowest age? 3.5 years. 3.5 years of age, you can start using that screener. So we have the tools, Caitlin. It's time to start using them. Mm-hmm.
That's amazing. Nell, I wonder if you could just put the name of that in the chat. Yeah. Sorry.
Sorry, and Caitlin was going on. What else did you want, Caitlin?
Well, I guess I'm just wondering, do you see that there's a universal way that we could implement a screener like that? I mean, how would you like to see that in Montana? Would you like to see it in pediatricians' offices? I just don't, I'm trying to figure out how a school could do it, right? But that's tough with when you're looking at 3-year-olds.
Right. We have child find at 3 years of age. That's mandated by law. And yes, pediatrician's office, Nadine has worked to consider that. That's why there's now, they're both on iPads now. You can do early bird or language screen, but language screen is actually looking for the language indication system, and early bird was originally created to find early word reading indicator difficulties. So it's a literacy based screener. It now has some language indication systems in it as well. But the point is that we're moving towards a model where maybe our pediatrician's office will have them earlier. But right now, as a school-based team, I know that child find teams, and then you're now with the HB 352, we have to screen children in April, May, or June prior to entering their preschool program to find risk. And the only children that get to make it into the program are those that have that risk indication system that we will be funded for. So we need to be able to have a screener that is actually developmentally appropriate for a 3.5-year-old prior to preschool. So that would be that language screening tool.
Thank you. No.
Yeah, you can write me later on that, Caitlin.
Thanks, Nell. What a great resource. Any other questions? All right. Well, so thankful for everyone for being here. Grateful to our panel today from the Reading League Montana. We really appreciate this conversation and look forward to seeing people at the next Teacher Tuesday.
Thank you, Patty.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.